Thank you very much for having me. I'm from a predominant part of my work is with the K-12 sector and teacher education. So I hope that there's some resonance with yourself today. May I just get a sense of who might be working in schools and in teacher education? Okay, great. That's comforting to me. That's great. I hope you find my sharing, stimulating and engaging. Well, why 21st century literacies? I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but let's have a think together and be reminded once again, why 21st century literacies? And if you note, I have the, inverted commas around 21st century. Now, evidence from economists, predictors of real world success, right? So I give you 3 scenarios, okay? Which one is it, do you think? Evidence from economists. What accounts for real world success? What predicts real world success? 20% 21st century skills, 80% academic skills, or on the right here, 21st century skills, 50-50%, or that in the middle, 80% 21st century skills, 20% academic skills. Now, who says the one on the right? Show of hands. No one? Okay. Who says this one over here, 50-50? No one? Okay. And who says the one in the middle? Wow. See? Yeah, preaching to the converted, right? Okay. See how much we resonate today? Okay. And I haven't even started. Well, 21st century literacy, since the 1950s, what we conveniently call and term it as an umbrella term in many educational policies, K-12, tertiary education, and workplace learning, what we see here is that in the 1950s, there was a sharp rise in attention to dispositions like collaboration, criticality, creativity. If you look at Hobsbawm post-World War II, Hobsbawm, the historian, wrote about the age of extremes, where 1914 to 1991 was, he termed the age of catastrophe, very violent in our recent history. And that spawned the importance and really raised post-World War II the importance of collaboration, of critical thinking. And in 1950s, 60s, the Sputnik shock, the race to the moon, all right, spurred renewed interest in technological innovation and creativity. But beyond these more instrumental aims, we're educators here, right? All of us. We know that 21st century literacies, convenient term as it is, date as far back as Plato's Ion, right? And it is an enduring aim of education. It is, absolutely inaccurate to say that these were 21st century literacies, even though they are more foregrounded in today's landscape. So an enduring aim of education, we think about, hey, receiving an education is far different from being an educated person. So the next question is, what counts as an educated person? Brian Crittenden in 1978, right, shared about autonomy as an aim of education. Amongst educators today, we can have a reminder sometimes of what's the aim of education, and this is but one. The educated person, according to Crittenden's argument, is the autonomous person, and autonomous looks at self-rule. And today we talk so much about self-regulation, but the self-rule, the self-regulation talks about the authentic self, right? And the authentic self is capable of intellectual autonomy, moral autonomy, and emotional autonomy. Often quite surprising now that the Asian high-performing systems like Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea were always in the papers for topping the PISA tests. Firstly, in literacy, in numeracy, and then, PISA brought in collaborative, creative problem solving. And surprise, surprise, we topped that too, right? So when we topped literacy and numeracy tests, we often get critiqued and say, well, these Asians, they're very good at mugging, they're very good at drilling, skilling, repetition, okay? And then, lo and behold, we did well in the creative test too. And somebody said, oh, there must be something wrong with the test. Okay, so we're always caught. It's either way. But they're not wrong. I think the general understanding of, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but often when you think about Asian high-performing systems, what comes to your mind? You don't have to be polite. Don't worry. Well, someone recently congratulated me at a talk and said, oh, Singapore came out tops again. And then I said, well, if we were doing our job well enough, we might dip in the, I was hoping that we would dip in the rankings if we were doing our job well enough. So no need to be polite. Is Asian high-performing systems? What comes to your mind? Road system. Sorry? A road system. Road system, yes. Anyone else? Obedience. Yes, I'm very obedient, yes. Yeah. Confucianism, right? Okay, and often this surprised me myself, all right? When I learned about this and when I understood, in Confucianism, often when you think about Confucianism, some of us call the East Asian high-performing, education systems the chopsticks culture, because it's the Confucian culture. But you often think about rote, you often think about drilling, about repetition. But in fact, if you think about Confucianism, Confucian tradition talks about the education as nurturing the autonomous mind. And the autonomous mind is understood. You see some 6 dimensions of Chinese words there. And the character that you keep seeing through all of it is 自. 自 means self. So the first means 自由, which is liberty, all right, from within to the external self. 自然, which is natural, following what is natural. All right, passion, intrinsic, some of the words that we hear today. 自省, which is self-reflection. 自得, which is getting it by oneself or for oneself, right? That means working at mastery, getting it for yourself, ownership, if you will. 自任, taking it upon oneself, the responsibility for learning. And 自律, which is self-discipline and self-management, right? Okay? And it is in fact, it celebrates and privileges creative, independent, and critical thought. Okay? All right? And this is a time where we reflect that, in fact, many of our education systems in East Asian societies are in fact post-colonial. They're in fact borrowed largely from our European counterparts and imperialists from the old. But in fact, in its heart, educational philosophy was very much in Confucian tradition about nurturing the autonomous mind. So 21st century literacies, reality or rhetoric today, we see the proliferation of 21st century curriculum frameworks, K-12, tertiary, workplace, in the US, in the Australian curriculum, understood as general or articulated as general capabilities. And the Singapore framework also, we have the Ministry of Education has a 21st century competencies total curriculum framework. And if you look at them in detail, you see the repetition or the similarity, critical and creative thinking here, or inventive thinking. I like to highlight this. In Singapore is one of the only curriculum that chooses very specifically and intentionally not to use the term creative. We choose to use the word inventive, okay? Because we're looking for not creative, aesthetically artistic, persons, but we're looking at Nobel laureates and inventors, a very technical, functional approach, all right, to creativity. The other thing that's very special about the Singapore curriculum is this notion of risk-taking. When you unpack any of these competencies and you look deeper at the curriculum documents, risk-taking, Singapore curriculum has a word before risk-taking. It describes the type of risk-taking. Any idea what it is? And it's only in the Singapore curriculum. Not any form of risk-taking, but informed. Anyone else? Hazard a guess? Responsible. Obedient risk-taking? No. Sorry? Yeah, considered or thoughtful risk-taking, calculated risk-taking. So we have to be very calculated, very measured, very conservative in our risk-taking, right? Okay? The irony. Now, So we have all those, the proliferation of 21st century competencies or literacies, educational frameworks, which was formalized in 1996 in UNESCO's Dolores Report, The Treasure Within. But what do empirical studies nationally and internationally tell us about the change of instructional core in classrooms? What we find is a consistent finding, right? Across numerous, empirical studies, large-scale system studies, that there are pockets of innovation, but exceptions prove the rule. And what's the rule? The rule is that big green circle in the middle when you walk into classrooms today. Still, despite the efforts of innovative pedagogues and curriculum and teacher educators, what you see largely, all right, is still that big green bubble where the teacher remains the main source of information. Information and knowledge is seen to be discrete facts, to be acquired, tested through repetition, memory, recall. And you've got all these exciting research around rich, complex, authentic tasks, problem-based learning, dialogic learning, epistemic learning, but they are exceptions that prove the rule. So what's the major knowledge practice gap? We have a challenge. We have a collective challenge as an international educational fraternity. And that is one big question. How do we effectively design, scaffold, assess formatively, especially the learning of 21st century literacies in schools and classroom? And this largely inspires my research and research of colleagues in my lab back in Singapore around how we can design more student-generative, collaborative dialogic learning, leveraging on digital formative learning analytics feedback, particularly to foster dispositions like collaborative, creativity, and criticality. So this is a snapshot of some of the work that we do in very close co-design partnerships with policymakers, with schools, teachers, leaders, as well as researchers. But today I'll focus on one, WeRead, which is a collaborative critical reading and learning analytics platform. In a glance, it's a collaborative web reader, put simply, with metacognitive scaffolds and formative learning analytics visualizations. It was motivated in concert co-design with teachers to address the classroom challenges in language and literacy learning in schools, in grade 9 senior schools. There's still the challenge of predominantly print-based text, the scarcity of dialogue, limited opportunities for dialogue and feedback. And you can remember, just like myself, how much feedback do you get in a year, right? On reading, on your progress, on your reading and writing progress, on your comprehension. Probably what? At best, how many times a year? How many? 12. Wow. You're hardworking. Okay, all right. You're blessed, you have 12. Usually maybe about 4 times a year, probably, and maybe some quizzes in between, all right, 4 times because of the exams per term in semester. Right, so WeRead was targeted, had the intention or bore the aspiration of fostering a culture of reading and deeper reading as a rich social practice, all right, that privileges perspective-taking, meaning-making, especially around provocations and moral ethical dilemmas that were particularly relevant to our young people today. It promotes critical reading skills, metacognition, self and peer-regulated learning. As mentioned earlier, it was co-designed with teachers, school leaders, and policymakers, particularly in the English language domain for secondary, 15-year-olds, adolescents. And since 2015, the design sample, the pilot sample, the trial sample, experimental sample is about 1,000 students in 5 schools across 15 teachers plus. But this is just the analytical sample. And scaling is underway after 3 years of the proof of concept to broader learning settings, including primary as well as teacher education. So what is it? WeRead primarily in terms of its learning design. It's very simple, actually. It's a modest piece of work, to be very honest. It has 2 full learning affordances, and we're trying to get a proof of concept in there, design it with teachers, implement it, let it be very socially constructed, where teachers can own it and really sort of implement it and adapt it to their learners and their diverse learners' needs. So it has 2 full learning affordances, a scaffolded social dialogic learning, and dynamic formative learning analytics, visualizations that are tightly coupled with the social dialogic learning. So we give them a range of texts that we co-design, rich texts, provocations, moral, ethical dilemmas that are relevant to the young people. And before they comment, before they dialogue around it, we make them think around a series of epistemic frames. Some of you might be familiar with in language and literacy or critical reading, 7 critical lenses that are premised on Paul and Elder's wheel of critical reasoning and critical thinking, and 5 collaborative talk types. All right, collaborative talk types being ideation, justification, but also social talk. How do you agree with others? How do you productively, present an alternative viewpoint, challenge, probe, and how do you clarify? And very often in our classrooms, in our schools, we do not overtly instruct, or teach. How do you agree? How do you validate? How do you disagree? How do you probe? And how do you clarify? And we see that very much. Now, in terms of the dynamic formative learning analytic visualizations, in the learner dashboards, you'll see that it's very tightly coupled with the domain-specific sort of meta-schemas and skills that we want to develop in our young people. Around critical lenses usage, collaborative talk types, they get a sense of their interaction networks and their dialogic networks with classmates, as well as their 21st century learning profile, all right? That looks at things like how healthy is your learning mindset. Joseph talked a bit about Carol Dweck's work around growth mindset. We give them a sort of, make it visible to them in terms of their self-rating. What are their primary goal orientations when they approach learning? So these are 4 nested pedagogical frameworks and learning principles underpinning We Read. And I will touch primarily on, at its heart, it's situated or it's built upon multi-literacies as a pedagogical framework, which privileges situated practice of the learner, overt instruction, the important role of the teacher as facilitator, all right? Critical framing being the metacognitive scaffolds, and transform practice, which is student generative learning and articulation and co-construction of knowledge, all right? And this is situated in logic learning, assessment for learning, and computer-supported collaborative learning. I'd be very happy to talk about more of the details of every of these underpinning later on if you're interested. So very quickly, that was a learning design, and I'd like to share in the remaining time that I have some of the experienced pedagogical promises, but more importantly, discuss some of the dilemmas that we have in implementing such forms of computer-supported collaborative learning and formative learning analytic environments with the aim of fostering 21st century literacies in our young people. So some teaching and learning gains, right? Evidence of teaching and learning gains over 4 iterative cycles. At this, we did find how our students, so if you look at the graphs that are pointing upwards or the lines that are pointing upwards, okay, those are We Read versus the lines that are pointing downwards, being the conventional. Actually, this is not, so we found that We Read students, experience improvements in terms of learning engagement, particularly emotional, teacher-student relatedness, because the teacher was very much in the dialogue as well. All right, and can give badges and very much in the interactions around the critical reading exercise or learning environment. And critical fluency, which is an objective test of critical thinking skills as students approach texts. But what is concerning here, in fact, this is not the kind of graph that actually, that we want to see actually, because the ideal is that both improve, right? With We Read improving more. Because this is concerning and it became a reflection point for our teachers but it does really reflect a lot of findings that we find across studies where over time, and this is over a semester, you'll see that actually in the conventional classrooms, learning engagement drops, right? Unfortunately, teacher-student relatedness drops, closeness, and alienation, the inverse, increases, right? And critical fluency, is the only one sort of a bit buttressed from there, without significant increase in skills in the conventional classrooms, but sort of adverse effects in terms of the effective learning outcomes. We have teacher accounts of how they saw the quality of talk improve over the weeks. Learning analytics maps helping their young people to learn more about themselves instead of just a functional approach to the task at hand. And motivation and engagement, because they asked the teacher, will this map change, if I were to participate more? And I love this WhatsApp text that the teacher sent me. It sent me and said, oh, thanks, Jen. I thought the team might like to know we did really well in our national tests and our exams. That the national distinction average is 24.7%. And, this cohort that used reread over 2 years really, overshot the national distinction average. And we have our MOE colleagues saying, oh, congratulations. Okay, and I said, oh, that's so encouraging. I don't know that it's all due to reread though, but this is the kicker. That's what the teacher said. Okay, if you work with schools, you'll understand what I mean. Yes, all the time they spent on reread did not affect their performance. Okay, the teacher was worried that, they were worried when they participated in the learning innovation, that in fact the time spent would would cause diminishing performance. So they were just very, very relieved that it did not diminish performance. So that gives you a signal of where thinking is at and the conflicting responsibilities of a teacher-educator as a professional, or of a teacher as a professional. So students similarly echoed our teachers' accounts of the benefits of the learning, particularly deepening critical reading through scaffolded social dialogic learning. You see our students talking about having a safe space to explore a variety of ideas that strengthens their critical insights, how exposure to other people's views expands their own understanding of that, any point or any point has two sides, and so on and so forth. Now, in fostering self-directed learning through dynamic formative feedback, you also hear a lot of reflections from our students' accounts about how it makes visible the learning interactions, their learning progress, their learning attitudes, things that are more latent in addition to just test scores and performance, right? We also see very often this is what happens. This is what happens at the beginning. Even teachers that believe in social dialogic critical discourse, without an interaction map, what happens is that, you see the first graph there, that often happens. So in a 40-minute period, just to give you a sense, teachers will first usually start by looking at, say, hey, let's have a look at our maps right now. What are the lenses we're using? What are the talk types we're using? What are our interaction points right now? And throughout the 45 minutes, usually then, there are 2 intervention points where we say, let's stop, take a break, let's look at our maps, individually and as a class. What do you want to do? All right, later on we'll have a colleague who will talk a bit more, Professor David Carles, about feedback and how that loops into actionable insights, changes in behavior, and that's what we're trying to build in. All right, so analytics on itself and data in itself will not stimulate that. It's the pedagogical design and the scaffolding around that, the overt instruction and the design of the reciprocal loop leading to action is what we're aiming for. So what are the pedagogical dilemmas? I'll share 4 cultural tensions and then I'll leave you with 2 musings. 1, pedagogical, through this whole process, not only on reread, but in many of our learning innovations in schools, we experience 4 deep cultural shifts that are fraught, in the process of this shift. In mainstream schooling, the conventional model of common sense, institutional common sense, if you will, versus learning innovations like reread that tries to promote collaborative, social, dialogic, student-generative learning and dynamic feedback, you'll see the tension between an individualized culture moving to a socialized learning culture. Norm-reference, many of our assessments are still highly norm-reference. I'm not saying I'll touch on that later. I'm not saying that's bad in and of itself, but if it's only the predominant form of assessment, let's think about what the impact might be, and I'll show some empirical evidence later, versus personal-based goals, all right? Self-referenced feedback. Exam performance mindset versus a learning mastery mindset, and standardized structure, standardization of curriculum, standardization of many of the things we do, teaching efficiency that wins over learning effectiveness. Scaffolded, how do we design for scaffolded agency? All right, and I'm not advocating for an either or logic. I'm talking about how do we pull both together, both and the best of both, not throwing the baby out with bathwater. So whose mindsets are hardest to change, do you think? Around these cultural shifts. Hazard a guess? Sorry? Teachers? Did someone say teachers? Yeah? Okay. Who else? Policy makers. Yes. Administrators. Oh. Yes. Teachers, school leaders, policy administrators, students, parents. Whose mindsets are hardest to change? Hardest of that group. Shout out. Parents. Oh, parents. Yes. Now, what we found, and this is a synthesized version because we don't have sufficient time for me to give you all the data around this and our student voices and our teacher voices around this, but distilling from that, the move from individualized to socialized learning and assessment culture, I see two things, that there's social learning citizenry and connective literacy. These are fundamental new literacies that are nascent and yet to emerge. And what do I mean by that? Social learning citizenry, I'm thinking about social learning requires a shift away, right, from a focus on self-interest and self-sufficiency and self-performance, right, to engage in productive help-giving and help-seeking. So when you see an interaction map, a network map, what comes to your mind? Right? Is it about you getting to the middle, okay, and winning the game? Or is it about thinking around who is excluded? Can I include them? How do I give help? Am I talking in my cliques only? Or should I reach out for more diverse views? All right? Connective literacy, seeing the capacity to learn and learning as an activity that is that is adaptive, that is fluid, that requires reciprocal transactivity. It's not purely an individual activity. You would be surprised, but it's very nascent and yet to emerge among the majority of learners. And no surprise, because if you think about the primary dominant teaching and learning practices that we enroll our students in, how much time do we devote, all right, to explicitly, overtly instructing and creating literacies around social learning and connective literacy, right? So what we see is our students reflecting the prevailing hegemony of individual outcomes and skills acquisition as much more important than social learning connections or interactions. And that, I think, is something, as an international fraternity, educational fraternity, we need more intentional pedagogic efforts to bring forward and foreground some of these more latent but very essential literacies, right? Now, norm and self-reference, the second mindset shift. We see very much our learning visualizations really are a double-edged sword. Yeah. So here, very quickly, since I only have 2 minutes, okay, I'll hazard a guess, okay? Self-referenced versus peer-referenced, what's the impact on these 4 dimensions of teaching and learning? In terms of critical fluency, test, skills. Self-referenced, peer-referenced, which one's better? Both up, both down, one up, one down? What do you think? Which one improves critical fluency better? Type of feedback, yeah? If you think about self-referenced data, feedback, versus peer-referenced feedback. Which one? Peer reference. What does peer reference do again? It improves critical fluency. Does it? Come on, Shane. Hazard a guess. You're the king of teaching and learning here in UniSA. No. Excuse me. Sorry?
C.
C? What's option C?
Crowdsource it.
Okay, option C. At this point, I wish I had met Joe earlier and that I would be able to build in his dynamic experimentation in here instead of having we did a classic sort of within class three condition split of no dashboard, self-reference dashboard, and peer reference dashboard, and this is the data that we got. Now, crowdsourcing says peer best, right? So peer reference would improve skills. Now, ta-da! Okay, no. Both improved, all right? Both improved. Both conditions improve critical fluency. Critical reading ability. Both? Oh, good job, Justin. Both. Okay. Cognitive engagement. Which one improves cognitive engagement? Peer? Okay. Who says peer? Hands up. Okay. Who says self? Okay, very good. More says peer. Okay. Self-referenced. Okay, improves cognitive engagement. Last one. Come on, your last chance. Right or wrong answer. Which one has the best explanation? Let's do it. Self? Yeah? Self? Who says self? Okay. Who says peer? Yes, okay. Now, self. So the point I want to say here is that we have empirical data, at least for this sample, showing us over 4 iterative trials that a personal best, okay, both improves skills, all right, and competencies. But if you were looking at more latent adaptive learning dispositions, lifelong learning, healthier, sort of well-being, if we're talking about academic self-concept, your sense of worth, personal best goals prove to be superior, I think, in this case, for nurturing both ends. All right? We see our young people talking about visible peer comparisons is a good thing. It's healthy peer pressure. It's competition. What I'm trying to pull out here is the complexity. It doesn't suit everyone. But that's why personalized and work like Joseph's is very important, because you can actually examine the power of personalized learning can then come in through dynamic experimentation. A lot more work that we need to do. All right? Performativity versus mastery. All right, students recurrently expressed overwhelming appreciation for reread as compared to their conventional classrooms in terms of reading practices. But so high or low student participation or usage, do you think? High or low? High, right? Who says high? Okay, who says low? This is like a, yes, sorry, yeah, okay. Low, student participation usage beyond the designated class time. So we did have teachers designating 1/3 of their lessons to reread, but outside of the designated class time, no matter how recurrently they express this appreciation, that the students walk up to me and say, I love reread, it gives us a space, it's so encouraging to me. But, and what are their reasoning logics? Let's have a look. Exams, okay? The second I love, okay, main problem, and these are recurrent, they're not one-off. The main problem, even though I presented my opinion, is I don't know whether it's right or wrong, unlike schoolwork. Unlike schoolwork, okay? So I think there's a lot of space to really think about, as Joseph asked earlier, beyond right or wrong answers. I know that there are many right or wrong answers in disciplinary content mastery, but apart from that, it's, how do we get our students to become more comfortable with discomfort? Okay? More teacher guidance about what? About performance. Okay, there should be a function for teachers to grade the posts, and it does not teach me how to score well. Okay, so that's a mindset of performance versus mastery, and a very strong tension there. So changing epistemic logics, I would argue, is a critical challenge for us as a community. All right? Carlota Perez talked about how the space of the technologically possible is much greater than that of the economically profitable or socially acceptable. And here I would extend that to say, or pedagogically meaningful. Schooling, let's remember, or formal education is a social institution with deeply entrenched, shared cultural logics, identities, norms, practices, and these socio-institutional common sense that we share, largely girded by our shared discourse, are often least observable but most powerful in undermining our best of intentions. And very often, I would say, there was a young gentleman here, I would agree with him that often students are a very powerful carrier of our pedagogical traditions. Because they're sophisticated thinkers, they go in and they know, because they're socialized, into what counts in education. So let's think of what we are telling our students, or what we're designing for our students to learn, as what counts in education, and what does it mean to be an educated person. I leave you with 2 musings. Firstly, through all of this, a large part of my work and what keeps me up at night is emerging from this work is the age-old pedagogical dilemma of pedagogical structure versus learner agency. We're not talking about sort of standardized fully standardization or standardization versus free choice. We're not making that comparison. We're talking about really understanding that the best of our intentions, our pedagogical intentions, often comes wrapped in barbed wire. And therefore, how can we, at the one time, design for scaffolded agency, especially as we work with younger groups of learners as they mature over their lifetime? And how do we structure for learning discomfort? And that's a shared burden and inspiration for all. And I will close with this slide. And I think together we can situate overtly learning analytics within the pedagogic ecology. I'm not the only person who says this in our community, in the learning analytics community. Dr. Kirsty Keto, pioneering committee members of SOLA, learning analytics community as a whole, people who are thinking about this, the leading thinkers in the community, acknowledges and writes about and urges us to consider that learning cannot be divorced from pedagogy, and therefore learning analytics by implication cannot be divorced from pedagogy. And learning analytics and pedagogy are conjoined endeavors, and of this, situating learning analytics pedagogically, and very importantly, privileging the voices of our students and our teachers are paramount. And I leave you the African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, we go together. Thank you very much.
We have time for 1 or 2 questions.
We do have a question online from Hong Mai. Do you think social media such as WeChat, WhatsApp or Instagram can be used as learning analytics platforms?
Do I think that social media tools can be used as learning analytics platform? It's a difficult question because it's sort of almost phrased inaccurately, I think. I think the question more is not so much about what technical platforms or what social media platforms or what interactional platforms are available. I think WeChat, I'm a big advocate that technologies and contemporary technologies, network technologies, social media technologies that are in young people's lives today are very rich contexts for learning. All right, I think what's important, and therefore, being rich context of learning, there's rich data that is generated around it that can be used to inform teaching and learning, right? But I think the more important point here is it's not the technology, it's what we do with it, and the learning, the instructional core, if you will, in Robin Alexander's work about the pedagogical core, the interaction between the material, the learner, and the instructor or the teacher. What are we designing in that tripartite relationship around these technologies and around the data that is generated? And how do we scaffold meaningful engagement with data that can purposefully inform productive learning behaviors and teaching behaviors? That's the crux of the question, I think.
Thanks. Any questions on?
Questions? Question up front.
So these transition points between, for example, K-12, so that first year, first semester university experience, or, that first time you get the master's class, they're almost like these key points where we can kind of knock our learners into new ways of thinking about their learning process. Have you thought much about what we can do with that discomfort? Because that is very uncomfortable. So I'd like to hear a bit more about that, because I think that's the key point, like that structure, but shifting them into feeling that that's okay is really quite traumatic for them. And we keep having these experiences where our students are almost rioting in classes, but then by the end they get it. So have you been playing around much with that?
Yes, I think very often it's our communication around what are learning outcomes. And very often our learning outcomes, our rubrics, our objectives, they're very explicit and static. So you've arrived or you have not, and nothing in between. I think the crux is sort of making the process more overt, making the dissonance. We all know about cognitive dissonance, but and cognitive dissonance can be a productive learning lever. Right? But how many of our students know that? I think we can ask, in our discourse with our students, how often do we overtly privilege this process? and make that evident. And say, I think on a couple of days ago, we talked about acceptance and commitment as part of cognitive behavioral therapy. I think it shares the same underpinnings. If we can make these latent, taken for granted, very important fundamental processes of teaching and learning process become evident, become foregrounded, that's where we're at. I think that's where our students can really engage, accept, and commit to the learning process.